The courier stepped into the 30th floor lobby of Thorn Capital Ventures at precisely 10:03 on a Tuesday morning, holding a cream-colored envelope thick enough to suggest consequence. The receptionist barely glanced up from her screen as he approached, accustomed to the rhythm of deliveries in a building where fortunes changed hands with the tap of a key. He placed the package on the polished mahogany counter, its weight making a soft thud that would echo longer than anyone in that moment could have imagined. For Mr. Damien Thorn, personal and confidential. The young woman reached for it with manicured fingers, but the courier shook his head. Direct signature required. She frowned, tapped her intercom, and within 30 seconds, Harrison Webb emerged from the executive wing, his tailored suit betraying nothing of the unease that had been building in his chest for weeks. He signed the digital pad with practiced efficiency, accepted the envelope, and watched the courier disappear into the elevator before allowing himself to examine what he now held. The return address bore a name he did not recognize. Hayes and Associates, Law Offices. He turned it over, once feeling the heft of whatever lay inside, and knew with the certainty of a man who had spent 8 years managing the details of another man's empire that this was not routine correspondence. The flap was tucked rather than sealed. His job, he reasoned, was to vet all incoming materials. He slid a finger beneath the fold. The cover letter was brief, typed on expensive stock. The words seemed to rise from the page with deliberate force. Petition for dissolution of marriage. Thorn, Geneva. A versus Thorn, Damien. R. Harrison's vision narrowed. He read the line again, certain he had misunderstood, but the legal language beneath it was unmistakable. Mrs. Thorn was filing for divorce. Here, now, delivered to her husband's office with all the discretion of a demolition charge. He flipped to the second page and saw the seal of the Cook County Circuit Court. The third page listed assets, disclosures, claims of fraud. His hands began to shake, not from fear but from the sudden realization that he was holding the detonator to a bomb he had unwittingly helped arm. All those calendar entries he had passed along. All those confirmations of Mr. Thorn's whereabouts. He pulled his phone from his pocket and dialed. The line rang 4 times before going to voicemail. Of course. He hung up and dialed again, the universal signal for emergency. 5 miles across the city, Damien Thorn stood beneath the rainfall showerhead in Vanessa Kingsley's loft, steam clouding the glass walls around him. The water was scalding the way he preferred it, hot enough to scour away the scent of her perfume before he returned to the world that believed him to be a man of singular focus and impeccable control. His phone, abandoned on the marble vanity, buzzed once. Then again, he ignored it. Whatever crisis had erupted in the markets or the boardroom could wait 15 minutes. He closed his eyes and let the heat work into his shoulders, tension uncoiling as he mentally catalogued the day ahead. Conference call with Seattle investors at 10:30. Lunch with the acquisitions team. An afternoon interview for the head of risk management position, a role he had been stalling on filling because he enjoyed the excuse to micromanage. The architecture of his life was seamless, every piece interlocking with precision. The phone stopped, started again. He swore under his breath, twisted the water off, and stepped out, wrapping a towel around his waist. Vanessa was in the other room, the sound of the espresso machine grinding beans drifting through the open door. She had already moved on to her own day, her own ambitions. That was what he admired about her. She required nothing from him but the occasional collision of their appetites. He picked up the phone. 2 missed calls from Harrison. A text appeared as he stared at the screen. "Mr. Thorn, you need to call me immediately. It's an emergency." Harrison did not use that word lightly. The last time had been a fire alarm evacuation. Damien dialed, leaning against the vanity, already annoyed. "Arthur, what's so urgent? It couldn't wait 15 minutes. The pause on the other end was long enough to prick the first real stab of unease. "Sir, someone just arrived. A courier. They delivered a package for you, personal and confidential." Damien exhaled through his teeth. "And it's from the law offices of Hayes and Associates." Harrison's voice was strained tight in a way Damien had never heard, and it was sent by Mrs. Thorn. The name hit him like cold water. Geneva, his wife, the woman he had left sleeping in their penthouse this morning, or so he assumed. He tried to picture her sending legal documents to his office and found the image absurd. Some charity proposal, perhaps. A foundation she wanted to launch. She had always been sentimental about causes. "What is it, Harrison? Some fundraiser nonsense?" "No, sir." The whisper was barely audible. "I've seen the heading on the top document. It's a petition. A petition for what?" The silence stretched. "A petition for dissolution of marriage, sir." The words landed without sound but with the force of a fist to the sternum. Damien's grip tightened on the phone, his knuckles whitening. He heard Harrison breathing on the other end, waiting for instruction, but his own mind had gone blank, a roaring emptiness where coherent thought should have been. "Say that again." "It's divorce papers, sir. Your wife is divorcing you." He ended the call without responding, the phone slipping from his hand onto the marble counter. Vanessa appeared in the doorway, a coffee mug in her hand, her expression mildly curious. "Everything all right?" "You look like someone just canceled Christmas. My wife is divorcing me." She blinked once, then took a slow sip from her mug, her gaze never leaving his face. "Well, I didn't see that coming. The quiet ones always are the ones you have to watch." Her detachment was like a slap. He wanted to shout, to demand sympathy or shock or something that acknowledged the magnitude of what had just imploded, but Vanessa only shrugged and turned back toward the kitchen. "What are you going to do?" He had no answer. He stood there, still damp from the shower, staring at his own reflection in the mirror, and saw a stranger. 6 months earlier, on a bright afternoon in March. Geneva, Ashford Thorne had been folding laundry in the penthouse she had once thought of as a palace, and had come to recognize as a cage with a spectacular view. The marble floors gleamed under the late-day sun streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows. Lake Michigan stretched beyond, cold and indifferent, a mirror for the silence that filled every corner of the space. She moved through the motions without thought, her hands smoothing wrinkles from custom-tailored shirts that cost more than some people earned in a month. The housekeeper usually handled this, but Geneva had sent her home early, craving the solitude even as it pressed against her like a weight. 3 months pregnant, she had begun to feel the changes in her body. The subtle thickening, the tenderness, the exhaustion that Damien had barely acknowledged beyond a single conversation where he had smiled his Forbes cover smile and said, "A son, an heir for the Thorne legacy." He had not asked how she felt. He had not marveled at the miracle. He had simply approved the acquisition. She reached into the pocket of one of his suit jackets, a charcoal Zegna he had worn 2 weeks prior to what he claimed was a dinner meeting with investors in Seattle. Her fingers brushed plastic. She pulled it free and stared at the object in her palm. A hotel keycard. Peninsula Hotel, Chicago, dated for a Tuesday night. The same Tuesday he had called her at 11 in the evening to say his flight had been delayed, and he was staying over in Seattle to meet with tech venture capitalists the following morning. Geneva stood very still, the card cool against her skin. She did not cry. She did not rage. She felt instead a strange and clarifying calm, as though a fog she had not known she was walking through had suddenly lifted. She had suspected for months. The late nights, the weekend emergencies, the faint scent of perfume that was not hers clinging to his collar. But suspicion was different from proof, and proof was a keycard that placed him 5 miles from home on a night he swore he was 2,000 miles away. She slipped the card into her own pocket and finished folding the laundry. Then she walked to the living room, poured herself a glass of water, and dialed the one person who had never stopped telling her the truth, even when she did not want to hear it. Rosalind Blake answered on the second ring. "Roz," Geneva said, her voice steady. "I need to see you. Today." They met at a cafe in Wicker Park, far enough from the penthouse and the gleaming towers of the financial district that Geneva felt she could breathe. Roz was already seated when she arrived, her red hair pulled into a messy bun, her expression sharp with concern, the moment she saw Geneva's face. "What happened?" Geneva placed the keycard on the table between them. Roz picked it up, read the date, and set it down with a sigh that was equal parts sorrow and fury. "I'm sorry, Jen." Geneva shook her head. "Don't be. I needed to know. What are you going to do?" The question hung in the air. Geneva traced the rim of her water glass with one finger, her mind already moving through the possibilities. Confrontation would lead nowhere. Damien would deny, deflect, and ultimately charm his way back into her good graces with an expensive gesture and empty promises. She had watched him negotiate hostile takeovers. She knew how he operated. "I'm going to see a lawyer." Roz leaned back, surprise flickering across her features. "A divorce lawyer?" Geneva nodded. "But not just any lawyer. I need someone who can win." Roz pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts. "Margaret Calloway. She's a shark. Represented my college roommate's aunt in a case against a hedge fund manager who tried to hide assets in 3 states. Destroyed him in court. That's who I need." Within an hour, Geneva had an appointment scheduled for the following week. She returned to the penthouse that evening and smiled when Damien came home at midnight smelling of whiskey and that faint floral perfume. She asked him how Seattle had been. He told her it was productive. She nodded and went to bed, her mind already 3 steps ahead. The following Saturday, Geneva decided to clean out the garage, a task she had been putting off for months. The space was filled with remnants of their early years together, boxes of old files and forgotten belongings that neither of them had bothered to sort. She worked methodically, separating trash from items worth keeping, and came across a dusty cardboard box labeled Damien, College/Startup Years. She hesitated, then opened it. Inside were old textbooks, a framed photo of him at his first office, and a small plastic case containing several USB drives. She picked one up, turned it over in her hand, and on impulse plugged it into her laptop. The drive was password protected. She tried a few obvious options. His birthday, their anniversary, the name of his first company. Nothing worked. She was about to give up when she remembered a detail from one of his drunken nights of nostalgia, a story he had told about the first car he had bought with his signing bonus from his first real job. A Dodge Viper, candy apple red. License plate vanity tag Viv IPER 427. She typed it in. The drive unlocked. Most of the files were mundane. Tax documents from a decade ago. Business plans that had never gone anywhere. But buried in a folder mislabeled Econ Notes was a series of PDFs. She opened the first one. Delaware Trust Fund. Establishment date April 2022. Initial deposit $500,000. Geneva's breath caught. April 2022 was 2 full years before Damien had proposed to her. She scrolled through the documents, her pulse quickening. The trust had been funded with money from his early career bonuses, money he had never mentioned. The trust had been used to invest in emerging biotech startups, real estate developments, and a tech incubator that had quietly exploded in value. She opened a spreadsheet dated 6 months prior. The trust's estimated value, $87 million. Geneva sat back, staring at the screen. When they had gotten engaged, Damien's lawyers had presented her with a prenuptial agreement. She remembered the meeting clearly. They had been in a sterile conference room, and a man in an expensive suit had walked her through the terms. In the event of divorce, she would receive a one-time payment of $5 million. She would forfeit any claim to Thorn Capital, their properties, and his future earnings. The agreement was contingent on full disclosure of assets. She had signed. She had trusted him. The Delaware Trust was nowhere in that disclosure. Geneva closed the laptop and pressed her palms to her eyes. He had lied. From the very beginning he had lied. And in doing so, he had committed fraud. A prenuptial agreement was only valid if both parties disclosed their assets in good faith. If he had hidden $87 million, the entire contract was invalid. She picked up her phone and called Margaret Calloway's office. The receptionist informed her that Ms. Calloway was booked until the following week, but Geneva's voice, calm and insistent, convinced her to check again. Tell her it's about a prenup fraud case involving a 9-figure asset. Tell her I have documentation. Margaret called her back within 20 minutes. The law offices of Hayes & Associates occupied the 15th floor of a boutique building in the Loop, all glass and steel and understated power. Margaret Calloway met Geneva in a conference room with a view of the river, her silver hair cut sharp as a blade, her eyes the pale blue of winter sky. Geneva laid out the USB drive, the hotel keycard, and a printed summary of the Delaware Trust documents. Margaret reviewed them without comment, her expression unreadable. When she finished, she set the papers down and folded her hands. Infidelity, while devastating, is legally irrelevant in Illinois. We're a no-fault state. He could be sleeping with half the city and it wouldn't matter in terms of asset division. Geneva nodded. I know. But this. Margaret tapped the trust documents. This is fraud. He failed to disclose a significant asset during prenup negotiations. That invalidates the entire agreement. So I can fight him. You can destroy him. Margaret's smile was thin and sharp. With this evidence, we're not talking about the $5 million he tried to lock you into. We're talking about 50% of all marital assets. His company, his properties, everything acquired during the marriage. Geneva felt a strange lightness in her chest, the first breath of air after years underwater. How do we proceed? We build an airtight case. I'll bring in a forensic accountant to establish the current value of the trust and trace any other hidden assets. We'll need bank statements, tax returns, anything you can access without tipping him off. Can you do that? Geneva thought of the penthouse, the home office. Damien rarely locked the casual arrogance with which he left his laptop open on the kitchen counter. Yes. Good. Margaret leaned forward. One more thing. Do not confront him. Do not let him know you're planning this. The moment he suspects, he'll move assets, hide money, and make this 10 times harder. You need to be invisible until we're ready to strike. Geneva met her gaze. I can do invisible. I've been doing it for 3 years. Over the following weeks, Geneva became a ghost in her own life. She smiled when Damien came home late. She asked polite questions about his day and listened to his answers with the attentiveness of a curator studying a forgery. She went to her prenatal appointments alone and told the nurses her husband was traveling for work. She ate dinners by herself in the vast dining room and felt the silence settle around her like armor. At night, when Damien was asleep or absent, she worked. She photographed tax documents. She forwarded emails to an encrypted account Margaret had set up for her. She cataloged every detail of their financial life, every invoice and statement, every piece of evidence that would prove what he had tried to hide. She also discovered more. In a filing cabinet in his home office, buried beneath old contracts, she found a folder marked Estate Planning. Inside were drafts of documents outlining custody arrangements in the event of divorce. The language was clinical, brutal. The child would reside primarily with the father. The mother's inconsistent income and lack of stable career made her an unsuitable primary guardian. Geneva read the words 3 times, her hands trembling. He had been planning this. Not just the affair, not just the lies. He had been planning to take her child. She took photographs of every page and sent them to Margaret with a message. He's not just hiding money. He's preparing to take custody. Margaret's reply was immediate. This changes everything. We go nuclear. By late April, Geneva had assembled a file thick enough to justify Margaret's optimism. The forensic accountant, Dr. Theodore Brennan, had completed his analysis. The Delaware Trust was now valued at $87 million. But more damning, he had found a second hidden asset, a Nevada LLC holding commercial real estate investments worth an additional $35 million. Neither had been disclosed in the prenuptial agreement. Margaret scheduled a meeting to review their strategy. Geneva sat across from her in the same conference room where this had all begun, her hands resting on her growing belly. We have enough to invalidate the prenup and pursue a 50-50 division of marital assets. Margaret's voice was steady, confident. But here's the choice you need to make. We can also report the Nevada LLC to the IRS. Unreported income on that scale is a federal crime. It could result in an investigation, fines, possibly prison time. Geneva considered. Do we need that? No. But it gives us leverage. If he fights dirty, we can escalate. If he tries to drag this out or weaponize custody, we remind him that we hold a card that could end his freedom. Geneva nodded slowly. Use it as leverage, not as a first strike. Smart. Margaret made a note. Now. Timing. When do you want to file? Geneva had been thinking about this for weeks. She had watched Damien's calendar, tracked his patterns. She knew he had a charity gala planned for mid-August, a high-profile event where he would stand before donors and cameras and speak about family and legacy. She knew he would want her there, radiant and pregnant, the perfect accessory to his carefully curated image. She also knew, thanks to Harrison Webb, that Damien spent his Monday mornings at Vanessa Kingsley's loft. The first Monday after the gala, September 2nd, 10 in the morning. Margaret raised an eyebrow. Specific. Geneva's smile was cold. I want the papers delivered to his office while he's with her. I want his professional world and his secret world to collide. I want him to know that I see all of him. Margaret studied her for a long moment, then nodded with something that looked like respect. Consider it done. The months that followed were a study in endurance. Geneva attended the prenatal yoga classes Damien's assistant had enrolled her in and made polite conversation with other expectant mothers who spoke of nurseries and baby showers. She went to dinner parties where she stood beside her husband and accepted compliments on how radiant she looked, how lucky they were. She felt like an actress in a play, hitting her marks, delivering her lines, waiting for the final act. In June, she was hospitalized for elevated blood pressure. Preeclampsia, the doctor said, stress-induced. She needed rest support, reduced anxiety. Damien did not visit. He sent flowers. White peonies. Her favorite, or so he thought. She had never told him she preferred gardenias. Harrison Webb, however, did visit. He arrived with a basket of books and a quiet apology. I'm sorry, mister. Thorne couldn't make it. He's in the Hamptons with clients. Geneva looked at him, this man who had been her husband's loyal shadow for nearly a decade, and saw the fracture in his expression. She made a decision. Harrison, can I ask you something? Of course, Mrs. Thorne. Do you have children? He hesitated, then nodded. 2 daughters, 7 and 9. Geneva's voice was soft, careful. What do you want them to learn about how men should treat the people they love? Harrison did not answer immediately. He looked down at his hands, then back at her. The truth, he said quietly. She let the silence sit for a moment, then spoke again. I'm going to need help. Not money, not betrayal. Just the truth, his schedule, where he really is when he says he's somewhere else. Can you do that? Harrison closed his eyes briefly, a man at a crossroads. Then he nodded. Yes. August arrived with the oppressive heat of a Midwestern summer. The charity gala was held at the Art Institute, a glittering affair of silk gowns and champagne and speeches about giving back. Geneva wore a floor-length navy dress that accommodated her 7-month belly, her hair swept into an elegant chignon. She stood beside Damien as he addressed the crowd, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder, the picture of devotion. He spoke of family, of legacy, of the importance of building something that would outlast them all. The audience applauded. Geneva smiled. And in her purse her phone buzzed with a message from Margaret. Everything is ready. Confirm date and time. Geneva excused herself to the restroom, locked herself in a stall, and typed out her reply. Monday, September 2nd, 10 a.m. His office. Make it public. Margaret's response was immediate. Done. Geneva returned to the gala, took Damien's arm, and posed for photographs. She felt light, untethered, as though she were already gone. The weekend before Labor Day, Damien left for the Hamptons. Business, he said. Geneva did not ask questions. Harrison had already confirmed what she needed to know. Vanessa Kingsley would be there. They would return late Sunday, and Monday morning Damien would go to Vanessa's loft as he did most Monday mornings. Geneva spent the weekend alone in the penthouse, packing a single suitcase with essentials. She wrote a brief letter to the household staff informing them of her extended absence and ensuring they would be compensated. She transferred funds from her personal account into a new one opened under her maiden name, Ashford. She stood at the window overlooking the lake and felt the life she had known falling away like old skin. On Monday morning she woke before dawn. She dressed simply in jeans and a loose sweater, her belly a quiet assertion of what she was fighting for. She called a car service and gave the driver an address in Lincoln Park, a quiet cafe where no one would think to look for her. At 9:50 she sent a final message to Margaret. I'm ready. At 10:03, the courier walked into Thorn Capital Ventures and delivered the envelope that would change everything. Geneva sat in the cafe, her hands wrapped around a decaf latte, and waited. She did not feel triumphant. She did not feel vindicated. She felt for the first time in years like herself. The woman who had once run an art gallery. The woman who had believed in her own voice before she had learned to silence it. Her phone buzzed. A message from Margaret. "It's done. He knows." Geneva set the phone down and looked out the window at the city, awake and indifferent and full of possibility. She placed a hand on her belly where her daughter, she had learned 2 weeks ago that the baby was a girl, rested beneath her ribs. For months she had felt trapped a prisoner in a tower of glass and marble, but now as the morning light slanted across the table, she felt the first stirrings of something she had almost forgotten. Freedom. Damien Thorn made 3 phone calls in the span of 7 minutes, each one more desperate than the last. The first was to his personal attorney, Richard Vaughn, a man whose hourly rate could fund a small nonprofit for a month. The second was to his head of security, demanding surveillance footage from the penthouse lobby for the past 72 hours. The third was to Geneva's phone, which rang 6 times before going to voicemail. He did not leave a message. His hands were shaking too badly to trust his voice. Vanessa watched from the doorway of her bedroom, already dressed for the day in a charcoal suit that suggested she had places to be and no intention of letting his crisis derail her schedule. She sipped her espresso with the detachment of someone observing a car accident from a safe distance. "You should probably get dressed. You have that conference call in 20 minutes. Cancel it." She raised an eyebrow. "You're the CEO of a billion-dollar venture capital firm, and you're going to cancel a call with Seattle investors because your wife filed for divorce." He turned to face her, and the look in his eyes must have been raw enough to make even Vanessa pause. "This isn't just a filing. This is a declaration of war." Vanessa set her mug down on the counter, her expression cooling. "Then I suggest you start fighting, but not here. I'm not getting dragged into whatever mess you've made of your marriage." The words landed like a slap. Damien stared at her, searching for some flicker of sympathy, some acknowledgement that what they had shared over the past year meant something. But Vanessa's gaze was already shifting toward the door, toward the world beyond this moment, and he realized with a sickening clarity that he had never been anything more to her than a transaction. "Get out, Damien." He dressed in silence, pulling on yesterday's clothes, his movements mechanical. When he left the loft, Vanessa did not say goodbye. The door closed behind him with a finality that felt like punctuation. Richard Vaughn's office was a cathedral of mahogany and leather designed to project confidence and cost. Damien arrived 20 minutes after the phone call, disheveled and hollow-eyed, and found his attorney already reviewing the petition. Richard was in his early 60s with silver hair and the kind of calm that came from decades of navigating other people's disasters. He did not look up as Damien entered. "Sit down." Damien sat. "What are we looking at?" Richard closed the file and leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled. "We're looking at a very well-constructed case for prenuptial fraud. Your wife is claiming that you failed to disclose significant assets prior to the marriage, rendering the agreement invalid. That's insane." "I disclosed everything." "Did you?" Richard's tone was neutral, but his gaze was sharp. "Because according to the forensic accountant she's hired, there's a Delaware trust valued at $87 million that doesn't appear anywhere in your prenup disclosures. There's also a Nevada LLC worth another $35 million. Were those assets disclosed?" Damien's throat tightened. The Delaware trust had been his safety net, a private fund he had established years before he met Geneva. The Nevada properties were investments he had made through shell companies, legitimate but intentionally obscure. He had never thought she would find them. He had never thought she would look. Those were separate. They weren't marital assets. "Doesn't matter. If they existed before the marriage and you didn't disclose them, the prenup is fraudulent. And if the prenup is fraudulent, she's entitled to 50% of everything acquired during the marriage." Damien felt the floor tilt beneath him. 50%. Half of Thorn Capital, half of the penthouse, the properties, the portfolio he had spent 2 decades building. He had signed the prenup to protect himself, to ensure that in the unlikely event of divorce, he would remain whole. Now, it was the weapon she was using to destroy him. Can we fight this? Richard picked up the file again, flipping through pages with the practiced efficiency of a surgeon. We can try. But her lawyer is Margaret Calloway. She doesn't file unless she's certain she can win. And this evidence he tapped the documents is damning. You're going to lose the prenup. The question is how much else you lose in the process. What do I need to do? First, do not contact Geneva. Not by phone, not by email, not through intermediaries. Every word you say to her can and will be used against you. Second, we need to start damage control. Talk to your board. This is going to go public, and you need to control the narrative before it controls you. Third, consider settlement. A prolonged court battle will cost you more than money. It will cost you your reputation. Damien's jaw tightened. She doesn't get to humiliate me and then walk away with half of everything I've built. Richard's expression did not change. Then prepare for war. But understand that war has casualties. And in this case, you're already bleeding. The board meeting was scheduled for Wednesday morning, 2 days after the petition was filed. Damien spent those 48 hours in a haze of sleepless nights and frantic strategizing, calling in favors, consulting crisis management firms, drafting statements that would make him sound victimized rather than villainous. But when he walked into the conference room on the executive floor of Thorn Capital, he knew immediately that the battle was already lost. The board consisted of 7 members, all of whom had made fortunes by knowing when to cut losses. They sat around the long glass table, their expressions ranging from concern to cold calculation. At the head of the table was Catherine Merrick, the lead independent director, a woman in her late 50s who had built and sold 3 companies and had no patience for incompetence. She did not offer pleasantries. Damien, we've reviewed the petition. We've also reviewed the media coverage. The Wall Street Journal ran a piece this morning. Forbes is preparing a follow-up. This is a problem. It's a personal matter. It stopped being personal the moment it became public. Catherine's voice was steel-wrapped in silk. You're the face of this firm. When people invest with Thorn Capital, they're investing in your judgment, your integrity. A fraud allegation undermines both. The prenup issue is a misunderstanding. My lawyers are handling it. Your lawyers can't handle the optics. One of the other board members, a man named Gregory Ashton, leaned forward. The narrative right now is that you cheated on your pregnant wife and hid over $100 million in assets. That's not a misunderstanding. That's a character indictment. Damien's hands curled into fists beneath the table. What are you suggesting? Catherine exchanged a glance with the other members, a silent consensus passing between them. We're suggesting you step down as CEO, temporarily, until this is resolved. The words hit him like a physical blow. Step down. You'll retain your position as chairman of the board. You'll still have a voice. But the day-to-day operations need to be led by someone who isn't embroiled in a public scandal. We've already identified an interim CEO, Harrison Webb. Damien's vision narrowed. Harrison, the man who had been his right hand for 8 years, the man who had delivered the petition. He forced himself to breathe, to think, but the room felt airless. This is a mistake. Catherine's expression softened, but only slightly. This is survival, yours and ours. If you fight us on this, we'll call a vote. And I don't think you'll like the outcome. Damien looked around the table searching for an ally, but found only the polite indifference of people protecting their investments. He stood his chair scraping against the floor. Fine. But this isn't over. No one responded. He left the room and felt the weight of their silence follow him like a shadow. Geneva did not watch the news coverage, but Roz sent her screenshots. Billionaire CEO steps down. Amid divorce scandal. Thorn Capital in crisis as fraud allegations surface. Pregnant wife files for divorce, claims hidden assets. The headlines were brutal, efficient, designed to reduce a man's empire to rubble in 140 characters. She sat in the Lincoln Park brownstone she had rented under her maiden name, a 3-bedroom walk-up with hardwood floors and a small garden out back. It was a far cry from the penthouse, but it felt like home in a way that marble and glass never had. Roz was there, unpacking boxes, hanging curtains, filling the space with the kind of warmth that came from people who cared without conditions. "How are you holding up?" Geneva looked down at her hands, which had stopped shaking sometime in the past 24 hours. I'm fine. Better than fine, actually. You just took down one of the most powerful men in Chicago. You're allowed to feel something other than fine. I feel free. Geneva's voice was quiet but certain. For the first time in 3 years, I feel like I can breathe. Roz smiled the kind of smile that held both pride and relief. Good. Because the hard part's just starting. Margaret had warned her that the settlement process would be grueling, but Geneva had underestimated the sheer volume of paperwork depositions and legal maneuvering required to dismantle a marriage to a man who had spent his career avoiding accountability. Over the following weeks, she sat through meetings with forensic accountants, tax attorneys, and valuation experts, each one dissecting the financial architecture of her former life. Dr. Theodore Brennan was methodical, almost obsessive in his analysis. He traced every transaction, every transfer, every shell company that Damien had used to obscure his wealth. The Delaware Trust had been the first discovery, but it was only the beginning. Brennan found offshore accounts in Wyoming, real estate holdings in Montana, investment partnerships buried under layers of LLCs. By the time he finished, the total undisclosed assets exceeded $130 million. Margaret laid out the findings in a conference room meeting that felt more like a military briefing. This is leverage. If he tries to claim the prenup should stand, we show the judge this. If he tries to fight custody, we show the judge this. If he tries to drag this out, we remind him that we can escalate to the IRS and turn this into a criminal matter. Will it come to that? Not if he's smart. Margaret's smile was thin. And despite everything, your husband is smart. He'll settle. Geneva wanted to believe her, but she knew Damien well enough to understand that his intelligence was often overshadowed by his arrogance. He would not go quietly. He would fight not because he believed he could win, but because losing was intolerable. The first deposition took place in mid-September in a sterile conference room with fluorescent lighting and a court reporter whose fingers moved across the keys with mechanical precision. Damien sat across from Geneva for the first time since the petition had been filed, his lawyer at his side, his expression carefully neutral. But Geneva could see the strain in the set of his jaw, the tightness around his eyes. Margaret began with procedural questions, establishing timelines and asset acquisitions, but it did not take long for the real interrogation to begin. Mr. Thorne, did you disclose the existence of the Delaware Trust to your wife prior to signing the prenuptial agreement? I don't recall. You don't recall whether you disclosed an $87 million asset, Richard Vaughn interjected. My client is not required to remember every detail of a conversation that took place over 3 years ago. Margaret did not break stride. Let me rephrase. Did you provide a complete and accurate list of your assets to your wife's legal counsel during prenuptial negotiations? I provided what was required. Was the Delaware Trust on that list? Damien hesitated, and in that pause Geneva saw the truth. No. Why not? Because it was a private investment fund. It had nothing to do with the marriage. But it existed before the marriage, correct? Yes. And under Illinois law, full disclosure of premarital assets is required for a prenuptial agreement to be valid. Correct. Richard Vaughn leaned forward. This is a legal interpretation, not a factual question. Margaret turned to the court reporter. Let the record show that Mr. Thorne's counsel is instructing him not to answer. She turned back to Damien. Did you disclose the Nevada LLC? Again. Damien's silence was answer enough. Margaret spent the next 2 hours methodically dismantling every defense, every justification, until the room felt less like a deposition and more like a public execution. When it was over, Damien stood without a word and left his lawyer trailing behind him like a pallbearer. Geneva stayed seated, her hands folded in her lap. Margaret gathered her files with the satisfaction of a general who had just won a decisive battle. He'll settle now. No question. But Damien did not settle. Instead, he filed a counter-motion claiming that Geneva had abandoned the marital home and forfeited her right to exclusive use of the penthouse. He requested joint custody, arguing that his financial resources made him the more stable parent. He disputed the valuation of the Delaware Trust, claiming it was inflated. Every move was designed to delay, to exhaust, to force Geneva into a corner where she would accept less than she deserved. Margaret responded with surgical precision. She filed a motion for exclusive use of the penthouse, citing Geneva's pregnancy and Damien's infidelity as grounds. She submitted medical records documenting Geneva's hospitalization for preeclampsia, with notes from her doctor explicitly stating that stress from lack of spousal support had exacerbated the condition. She introduced emails and calendar entries provided by Harrison Webb, proving that Damien had spent more nights at Vanessa Kingsley's loft than at home. The judge, a no-nonsense woman in her early 60s named Patricia Brennan, reviewed the filings with visible impatience. At a hearing in early October, she cut through the legal posturing with the efficiency of someone who had seen too many powerful men try to weaponize the system. "Mr. Vaughn, your client is asking for joint custody, while simultaneously arguing that he should retain the penthouse because Mrs. Thorne abandoned it. Those positions are mutually exclusive. Either he wants to co-parent, in which case Mrs. Thorne needs stable housing, or he wants the penthouse, in which case he's conceding that he's not interested in shared custody." "Which is it?" Richard Vaughn cleared his throat. "Your Honor, my client is simply seeking what's fair. Fair would have been full disclosure during prenuptial negotiations. Fair would have been supporting his wife during a high-risk pregnancy. I'm granting Mrs. Thorne exclusive use of the marital residence pending final settlement. Custody will be determined based on the best interests of the child, and given Mr. Thorne's documented absences, I'm inclined to award primary custody to Mrs. Thorne with supervised visitation for Mr. Thorne." The gavel came down, and Geneva felt something in her chest unclench. She had not realized how tightly she had been holding herself until that moment. Damien's world contracted. The penthouse, once his fortress, was now off-limits. He moved into a corporate apartment downtown, a sterile two-bedroom with rented furniture and no character. Vanessa had stopped returning his calls after the first week. The board had formalized Harrison Webb's appointment as interim CEO, and though Damien retained his chairman title, it was a hollow gesture. He attended meetings but had no real power. He reviewed reports but made no decisions. He was a ghost in his own company. At night, alone in the apartment, he replayed the past year in his mind, searching for the moment when everything had started to unravel. He thought of Geneva, the woman he had married because she was beautiful and cultured, and exactly what a man of his stature should have. He had never considered that she might have her own depths, her own capacity for strategy. He had mistaken her quietness for weakness, her patience for submission. He poured himself a glass of scotch and stood at the window looking out at the city he had once believed he owned. The light stretched endlessly indifferent and cold. He thought about calling her, about trying to explain, but he knew it would be pointless. She had already moved on. She had already won. In late October, Richard Vaughn called Damien into his office with the tone of a doctor delivering terminal news. "We need to talk settlement." "No. Damien, you've lost the prenup. You've lost the penthouse. You're about to lose primary custody. If this goes to trial, the judge will award her 50% of everything, plus legal fees, plus damages for emotional distress. You'll be paying her lawyers to destroy you. I don't care." Richard set down his pen and looked at Damien with something close to pity. "Yes, you do. You're just too proud to admit it. But let me be clear, B. If you fight this in court, Margaret Calloway will put you on the stand and ask you under oath about every affair, every hidden account, every lie you've told. She'll subpoena Vanessa Kingsley. She'll call Harrison Webb as a witness. She'll turn your life into a public spectacle. Is that what you want?" Damien's hands tightened on the armrests of his chair. "What are her terms? 50% of all marital assets, full custody with supervised visitation for you. She keeps the penthouse. You cover all legal fees. In exchange, she agrees not to report the Nevada LLC to the IRS." Damien closed his eyes. The Nevada account was the one liability that could turn this from a civil matter into a criminal one. Unreported income on that scale was federal fraud. If Geneva went to the authorities, he could face years in prison. How much are we talking? Marital assets total approximately $1.5 billion. 50% is $750 million, plus legal fees which are currently at $3 million and climbing. Damien felt the number like a blow. $750 million. More than he had ever imagined losing. But the alternative was worse. Draft the settlement. The final meeting took place in November in the same sterile conference room where the depositions had been held. Geneva arrived with Margaret and Roz, her movements careful as she navigated the last weeks of her pregnancy. Damien was already there, seated across the table, his face drawn and pale. Richard Vaughn had the settlement agreement laid out, pages and pages of legalese that reduced their marriage to a series of financial transactions. Margaret walked Geneva through each section, explaining the terms with clinical precision. Damien would retain his position at Thorn Capital, but would transfer half of his equity to Geneva. The penthouse would be hers. He would have supervised visitation rights contingent on completing a co-parenting course. All legal fees would be paid by him. In exchange, Geneva agreed to a non-disclosure clause regarding the Nevada LLC and waived any future claims to his assets. Geneva read through the document twice, her hand steady. When she reached the signature page, she paused and looked across the table at Damien. He was staring at the table, his jaw tight, refusing to meet her eyes. She picked up the pen and signed her name. Damien followed his signature, quick and jagged, as though he could not bear to linger on what it meant. Richard and Margaret witnessed, and the court reporter noted the time and date for the record. It was done. Damien stood without a word and walked out, his lawyer following. The door closed and the room was silent except for the faint hum of the fluorescent lights. Geneva set down the pen and exhaled a long breath that felt like releasing years of held tension. Margaret gathered the documents. "How do you feel?" Geneva placed a hand on her belly, where her daughter had been kicking all morning, as though sensing the shift in the world around them. "I feel like I just got my life back." Roz drove her home to the Lincoln Park brownstone, the autumn leaves falling in slow spirals against the windshield. Geneva watched the city pass by, familiar and yet entirely new, as though she were seeing it for the first time. The penthouse would be hers soon once the paperwork was finalized, but she had already decided she would not live there. She would sell it, take the money, and invest in something that mattered. A gallery, perhaps. Or a foundation, something that had her name on it, not his. That night, she stood in the small kitchen of the brownstone and made herself tea, the simple act grounding her in the present. Roz had gone home and the house was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet than the silence of the penthouse. It was the quiet of peace, of possibility, of a future that belonged to her alone. Her phone buzzed with a message from Margaret. "Board just announced Damien's permanent demotion. Harrison Webb is the new CEO. Thought you'd want to know." Geneva read the message twice, then set the phone down. She felt no triumph, no vindication. She felt only a distant sadness for the man Damien could have been if he had chosen differently. But that was his burden to carry now, not hers. She placed a hand on her belly and whispered to the daughter she would meet soon. "We're going to be okay. Better than okay." Outside, the first snow of the season began to fall, soft and silent, covering the city in a blanket of white. Geneva stood at the window and watched it accumulate, each flake a small act of transformation, and felt the weight of the past finally begin to lift. She was free, and she was just beginning. The call came at 2 a.m. on December 15th, jolting Geneva from the shallow sleep that had become her constant companion in the final weeks of pregnancy. She fumbled for her phone on the nightstand, her heart already racing before she saw the unknown number on the screen. "Hello, Mrs. Thorne. This is Dr. Patricia Morris at Northwestern Memorial. Your husband has been admitted to our emergency department." Geneva sat up, the weight of her belly making the movement awkward. "Ex-husband. What happened?" "He collapsed at his apartment. A neighbor found him and called 911. He's stable now, but he's been asking for you. We have you listed as his emergency contact." Geneva's first instinct was to hang up to let him face whatever crisis he had created alone, but something deeper than anger or resentment stirred in her chest. Perhaps it was the memory of the man she had once loved, or perhaps it was simply the recognition that their lives would remain entangled through the child she carried. Either way, she found herself speaking before she could stop. "I'll be there in 30 minutes." She dressed in the dark, pulling on maternity leggings and an oversized sweater, and drove through streets emptied by the late hour. The emergency room was a harsh collision of fluorescent light and antiseptic smell, the kind of place where time moved differently, measured in beeping monitors and hushed conversations. A nurse led her through a maze of curtained bays to where Damien lay on a narrow gurney, an IV line running into his left arm. He looked diminished. That was the word that came to her mind. The man who had once filled every room he entered now seemed to have collapsed inward, his face pale and drawn, his eyes hollow. When he saw her, something flickered across his expression that might have been shame. "You came." Geneva pulled a plastic chair closer to the bed but did not sit. "What happened?" "Panic attack." His voice was rough, as though speaking required effort. "The doctor said my heart is fine physically, but I thought I was dying. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Just this overwhelming sense that everything was ending." Geneva studied him, searching for signs of manipulation, some angle he was working. But she found only exhaustion and something that looked like genuine fear. "Everything has ended, Damien. You saw to that." "I know." He closed his eyes. "I keep replaying it. Every decision, every moment, I chose my ego over everything else. I knew what I was doing was wrong. I just didn't think there would be consequences. There are always consequences. Some of us just have the luxury of avoiding them longer than others." The machines around them beeped in steady rhythm, marking time in a space where consequences had finally caught up. Geneva felt the baby shift inside her, a rolling movement that pressed against her ribs. She placed a hand on her belly, grounding herself in the reality of what mattered now. "The doctor says you need to see a therapist. Not for me, not for appearances, for yourself. I started seeing someone 3 weeks ago." Damien's eyes opened, meeting hers. "Court-ordered for the co-parenting program, but I've been going twice a week on my own, trying to understand how I became someone I don't recognize." Geneva absorbed this, uncertain whether to believe it. Words were easy. Damien had always been skilled with words, but there was a rawness in his voice that felt different from the polished explanations he had offered during depositions and settlement negotiations. "I hope you mean that. Not because I care about your redemption, but because our daughter deserves better than a father who sees her as another acquisition. She's not mine to own." His voice cracked. "I understand that now. Maybe too late, but I understand." Geneva moved toward the door, suddenly exhausted by the weight of the conversation and the lateness of the hour. The nurse appeared with discharge papers, and Geneva stepped into the hallway to give them privacy. She leaned against the wall, one hand on her belly, and felt the complex tangle of emotions she had been holding at bay for months finally surface. Anger, yes. But also a deep sadness for what might have been if he had chosen differently, if she had demanded better from the beginning, if either of them had understood what partnership actually meant. When Damien emerged 20 minutes later, dressed in the clothes he had arrived in, he paused beside her. "Thank you for coming." "You didn't have to." "No, I didn't." Geneva straightened, meeting his gaze. "But I hope you understand that this changes nothing between us. The settlement stands. The custody arrangement stands. I came because it was the human thing to do, not because we're going to be friends. I understand." They walked to the parking garage in silence, and Geneva watched him climb into a rideshare before getting into her own car. As she drove home through the empty streets, she thought about the man he had been and the man he might become. But she also thought about the woman she was becoming, the one who could show compassion without compromising her boundaries, who could acknowledge complexity without excusing cruelty. The brownstone was dark when she arrived home, welcoming in its stillness. She climbed the stairs to the nursery, where everything was ready for a daughter who would arrive any day now. The cream-colored walls, the carefully chosen furniture, the mobile of painted birds, all of it a testament to the life she was building, one that belonged entirely to her. She placed both hands on her belly and whispered into the quiet. "Your father is trying to be better. I don't know if he'll succeed, but he's trying. And you deserve to see that effort, even if the outcome is uncertain." The baby kicked in response a firm pressure against her palm, and Geneva smiled, despite the exhaustion pulling at her bones. Hope Merchant Ashford arrived 18 days later on January 3rd at 6:47 in the morning, after 14 hours of labor that redefined Geneva's understanding of what her body could endure. Roz was there holding her hand through every contraction, breathing with her through every wave of pain. When the doctor finally placed the baby on Geneva's chest, still wet and screaming with the outrage of being born, Geneva felt something fundamental shift in the architecture of her heart. "She's perfect." Roz's voice was thick with tears. Geneva looked down at the tiny face, the eyes squeezed shut against the brightness of the world, the miniature fists waving in protest. This was not just new life. This was purpose crystallized into 8 pounds and 3 ounces of fierce determination. "I'm going to teach you to know your worth," Geneva whispered against the baby's damp head. "I'm going to teach you that you're not a possession or a prize or a problem to be managed. You're a person whole and complete, and you deserve to be treated as such." The nurses took Hope to be cleaned and measured, and Geneva leaned back against the pillows, her body trembling with exhaustion and exhilaration. Her phone buzzed with messages from Margaret, from Harrison, from the small circle of people who had supported her through the past year. She ignored them all, except for one. Damien had sent a text. "Congratulations. I hope she has your strength." Geneva stared at the message for a long moment, then typed a single reply. "She will, because I'm going to teach her." She did not wait for a response before setting the phone aside. The first 2 weeks were a blur of sleepless nights and constant feedings, of learning to interpret cries and navigate the terrifying responsibility of keeping another human alive. Roz moved in temporarily, handling laundry and meals and the 1,000 small tasks that made survival possible. But even with help, Geneva felt herself being remade by the relentless demands of motherhood. On the 14th day, when Hope was finally sleeping for stretches longer than 2 hours, a courier arrived with a package. Geneva signed for it with one hand while holding the baby with the other, and waited until Hope was settled in her bassinet before opening it. Inside was a letter on Thorn capital letterhead signed by Catherine Merrick, the lead board member. Geneva read it twice, her pulse quickening with each word. The board was offering to purchase her equity stake in the company for $900 million, 20% above the settlement value. The terms were simple. She would sign a perpetual non-disclosure agreement and agree not to establish any competing venture capital operations for a period of 10 years. The offer would expire in 30 days. Geneva set the letter down and walked to the window, looking out at the snow-covered street. $900 million. Enough to never work again, to dedicate herself entirely to raising Hope, to fund any philanthropic vision she could imagine. All she had to do was agree to be silent and stay out of their way. She picked up her phone and called Margaret. "I need your legal opinion on something." Margaret arrived within the hour, read the offer while sitting at Geneva's kitchen table, and let out a low whistle. "This is a lot of money. It's hush money." Geneva was nursing Hope, the baby's small hands kneading against her breast. "They're afraid of what I might do with insider knowledge. They're afraid I'll compete with them. Probably both." Margaret set the letter down. "The question is, what do you want to do?" Geneva looked down at Hope, whose eyes were starting to drift closed, milk-drunk and content. "I want to build something that matters. I want to prove that I'm more than just the woman who took down a billionaire, and I can't do that if I agree to be bought off and silenced." "Then you turn it down, and deal with whatever consequences come from that." Margaret's smile was sharp. "You've dealt with worse." Geneva called Harrison that evening after Hope was asleep and the house was quiet. He answered on the second ring, his voice cautious. "I assume you received the board's offer." "I did, and I'm refusing it." There was a pause. "Geneva, as your friend, I need to tell you that's not a smart business decision. That's generational wealth they're offering." "I know. But if I accept it, I'm accepting their definition of who I am and what I'm allowed to do. I didn't fight this hard for my freedom just to sell it back to them." Harrison sighed. "I told them you'd say that. For what it's worth, I agree with you. But it's going to make things complicated. how complicated they're going to make it difficult for you to fundraise. They'll put pressure on potential investors, spread concerns about your experience, question your motives. They see you as a threat. Good. Geneva's voice was calm. Let them be threatened. It means I'm doing something right. The backlash began within a week of her refusal becoming known. Geneva had begun preliminary outreach for the Ashford Impact Fund, leveraging her settlement resources and her network to build a portfolio focused on women-led businesses in arts and culture. The initial conversations had been promising. Several major investors had expressed serious interest. Then the calls started going unreturned. Meetings were postponed indefinitely. One investor who had been enthusiastic suddenly sent a terse email citing strategic realignment as the reason for withdrawing his commitment. Roz found Geneva in the nursery one afternoon staring at her laptop screen with Hope asleep in a carrier strapped to her chest. "What's wrong?" "3 investors pulled out today." Geneva's voice was flat. "All of them within an hour of each other. That's not coincidence. It's Thorn Capital. Obviously. But I can't prove it. They're too smart to leave fingerprints." Roz sat down on the floor beside the rocking chair. "So what are you going to do?" Geneva looked down at Hope, at the small face, peaceful in sleep, and felt her resolve harden. "I'm going to fight. I didn't come this far to give up because powerful men want me to disappear quietly." She spent the next 3 weeks rebuilding her strategy. Instead of chasing major institutional investors, she targeted a different demographic. Successful women who had built their own fortunes and understood what it meant to be shut out of traditional power structures. She reached out to female CEOs, entrepreneurs, inheritors of family wealth, who were looking for opportunities to invest in meaningful change. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within 2 weeks, she had secured commitments for $45 million, exceeding her initial goal. The investors were not just writing checks, they were becoming partners, advisors, champions of a model that valued impact alongside returns. Margaret helped her formalize the structure, and by late February, the Ashford Impact Fund was officially launched. The press coverage was extensive, framing it as a feminist response to the old boy networks of venture capital. Geneva gave a single interview to a business journalist from Bloomberg, choosing her words carefully. "I'm not doing this because I'm angry at men or because I want revenge on Thorn Capital. I'm doing this because there are brilliant women with transformative ideas who never get a fair shot at funding. I have the resources and the platform to change that, so that's what I'm going to do." The article went viral, shared thousands of times across social media, and suddenly Geneva was no longer just the woman who had divorced a billionaire. She was a player in her own right. But with visibility came vulnerability. The gallery space in Pilsen had been her secret project, funded quietly from her settlement and developed in partnership with a young curator named Maya Torres, who shared her vision for showcasing emerging artists. They had planned a modest opening for late March, inviting local collectors and art enthusiasts to preview the work of 12 women artists. 2 weeks before the opening, Geneva received a call from Maya, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. "We have a problem. Our major donor just pulled their funding. They're citing concerns about the gallery's financial sustainability, but I think someone got to them." Geneva was in the kitchen preparing a bottle for Hope while balancing the phone against her shoulder. "How major?" $100,000. "We were using it for operating costs for the first year. Without it, we can't afford to stay open past 6 months." Geneva set down the bottle and picked up Hope, who was starting to fuss. "Give me 24 hours. She called Harrison, explained the situation, and asked for his honest assessment. "Is this Thorn Capital?" Harrison was quiet for a moment. "Off the record. Probably. There are board members who see you as a threat to the company's reputation. They want you to fail visibly, so they can point to it as evidence that you were only successful because of Damien's resources. And on the record. On the record. I'm the CEO, and I don't control what individual board members do with their personal influence." Geneva felt anger rise in her chest, hot and clarifying. "I need you to be honest with me, Harrison. Are you going to help me, or are you going to protect your position?" The pause was long enough to hurt. Then Harrison spoke, his voice firm. "I'm going to help you, but I need you to understand that if I do this publicly, I'm risking everything I've built. I would never ask you to sacrifice your career for mine. You're not asking. I'm offering. Harrison's voice softened. I have 2 daughters, remember? I want them to grow up in a world where women like you don't have to fight this hard for every inch of ground. So tell me what you need. Geneva closed her eyes, feeling the weight of gratitude and responsibility. I need you to make a statement. Publicly support the gallery. Make it clear that anyone who tries to sabotage it is acting against the interests of the business community. Consider it done. Harrison's statement was released 2 days later, praising Geneva's entrepreneurial vision and announcing that he would personally attend the gallery opening. The effect was immediate. The donor who had pulled funding called to apologize and restore their commitment. 2 additional patrons reached out offering support. But Geneva knew the victory was temporary. The board would retaliate against Harrison eventually, and she would bear responsibility for whatever consequences followed. The gallery opened on March 29th, a crisp spring evening, when the last remnants of winter were finally releasing their grip on the city. Geneva stood in the main space surrounded by vibrant paintings and sculptures that challenged conventional narratives about beauty, power, and worth. Hope was with a trusted babysitter for the first time, and Geneva felt both liberated and anxious without the weight of her daughter against her chest. Roz appeared at her elbow with a glass of sparkling water. You did it. We did it. Geneva watched collectors move through the space, pausing before a particularly striking piece by an artist who had been rejected from every major gallery in Chicago. This is just the beginning. The evening was a success by any measure. Sales exceeded projections. Critics from major publications expressed genuine enthusiasm. But Geneva could not fully relax, waiting for the other shoe to drop. It came 3 days later in the form of a scathing review published in a prominent art journal. The piece dismissed the gallery as vanity project funded by divorce settlement millions and questioned whether Geneva had the expertise to curate serious contemporary art. The review was signed by a critic Geneva had never met, but a quick search revealed connections to several Thorn Capital board members. Maya was devastated when Geneva showed her the article. This is going to hurt us. People in the art world pay attention to this publication. Geneva read the review again, feeling the familiar sting of being underestimated. Or it's going to prove we have something worth attacking. Nobody bothers to write hit pieces on things that don't matter. She spent the following week reaching out to every artist in the exhibition, every collector who had made a purchase, every person who had attended the opening. She asked for testimonials, for honest assessments of the work, for evidence that the gallery was offering something valuable. The response was overwhelming. Dozens of people wrote passionate defenses of the exhibition and the gallery's mission. Geneva compiled them into a public response published on the gallery's website and shared across social media. She did not attack the critic or engage in personal accusations. She simply presented the evidence that the gallery was succeeding on its own merits and let the work speak for itself. The counter-narrative took hold. Other critics began publishing positive reviews, perhaps motivated by contrarian instinct, or perhaps by genuine appreciation for what the gallery represented. Within 2 weeks, the negative review had been buried under an avalanche of support. But Geneva understood the larger pattern. Every success would be met with attempts to undermine it. Every step forward would require defending ground already won. The question was whether she had the stamina for a war of attrition. The first supervised visitation with Damien was scheduled for early April at a family resource center in Evanston. Geneva had been dreading it for weeks, uncertain how she would feel watching him hold Hope, uncertain whether she could trust him to prioritize their daughter's well-being over his own needs. She arrived 15 minutes early. Hope bundled against the spring chill. The supervisor, Dr. Elena Rodriguez, greeted them with professional warmth and led them to a private room furnished with comfortable chairs and a playmat. Mr. Thorne should arrive shortly. How are you feeling, Protective? Geneva adjusted Hope's blanket. I know he has a legal right to see her, but that doesn't mean I trust him. That's understandable. The goal of these sessions is to build that trust gradually. You're welcome to stay or wait in the observation room. Most parents find it easier not to watch initially. I need to see how he is with her. Dr. Rodriguez nodded and made a note on her clipboard. Damien arrived exactly on time, looking better than he had at the hospital, but still carrying the weight of the past months in his posture. He stopped when he saw Hope in Geneva's arms, his expression unreadable. "May I?" Geneva looked at Dr. Rodriguez, who nodded encouragement. She stood and transferred Hope, carefully watching Damien's face as he took their daughter for the first time. His hands were awkward, uncertain, as though he had never held an infant before, which Geneva realized he probably hadn't. "Support her head." Geneva's voice was sharper than she intended. Damien adjusted his grip and Hope's eyes opened, focusing on his face with the solemn attention babies gave to new stimuli. For a long moment, father and daughter studied each other in silence. Then Hope began to cry. It started as a whimper, quickly escalating into full-throated wails. Damien looked panicked, shifting his hold, trying to soothe her, but Hope only cried harder. Geneva's instinct was to intervene immediately, to take her daughter back and comfort her. But Dr. Rodriguez placed a gentle hand on her arm. "Give him a moment to figure it out." Geneva watched Damien struggle, saw the desperation in his face as Hope's cries intensified. After 30 seconds that felt like hours, she stepped forward. "She's hungry. I need to feed her." Damien handed Hope back with visible relief, and Geneva settled into a chair to nurse. The baby latched immediately, her cries subsiding into contented gulps. Damien stood awkwardly nearby, watching. "I don't know what I'm doing. Nobody does at first." Geneva's voice softened, despite herself. "It takes time." The remainder of the visit was stilted but peaceful. Damien held Hope again once she was fed, and this time she did not cry. She simply stared at him with that intense infant focus, as though trying to memorize the features of this stranger who smelled wrong and held her differently than the person she knew. When the 2 hours ended, Damien returned Hope to Geneva's arms. "Thank you for bringing her. I didn't do this for you." Geneva stood gathering the diaper bag. "I did it because she deserves to know her father, if you can be one. I'm trying." Geneva left without responding, but as she drove home with Hope sleeping in the back seat, she found herself hoping that his trying would be enough. Not for his sake, but for Hope's. By May, a pattern had emerged. The Ashford Impact Fund was succeeding despite coordinated efforts to undermine it. The gallery was thriving despite negative press from certain quarters. Geneva was building something real, something that bore her name and reflected her values. But the cost was constant, vigilance against attacks from people who wanted her to fail. She was exhausted. Hope was sleeping better, but Geneva's nights were still fractured by feeding schedules and the low-grade anxiety that came with being entirely responsible for another life. Her days were consumed by meetings, strategy sessions, crisis management. She was succeeding, yes, but she was also running on fumes. Roz found her one afternoon in the gallery office, staring at her laptop with Hope asleep in a carrier against her chest. "You need to take a break." "I can't." Geneva gestured at the screen. "I have 3 investor calls this afternoon, a meeting with Maya about the summer exhibition, and a conference call with Margaret about the fund's quarterly report. Then delegate, hire an assistant, bring in a co-director for the gallery. You're trying to do everything yourself, and you're going to burn out. If I delegate, people will say I'm not really capable, that I was just writing divorce money and other people's labor." Roz pulled up a chair and sat down. "Jen, you're falling into the same trap he did, believing you have to control everything personally or it doesn't count. That's not strength, that's fear." The words landed with uncomfortable precision. Geneva closed her laptop and looked at her friend. "I don't know how to let go." "You start small. Hire someone you trust to handle scheduling. Let Maya make curatorial decisions without running everything past you. Bring in a managing partner for the fund. You built all of this, now let other people help you sustain it." Geneva knew Roz was right, but the thought of relinquishing control made her chest tighten with anxiety. Control had been her weapon, the thing that allowed her to dismantle Damien's empire and build her own. Letting go felt like vulnerability, and she had learned the hard way what vulnerability cost. But she also recognized that the model she was following, the one where she personally managed every detail, was the same model that had destroyed Damien. The irony was not lost on her. "I'll think about it. Think fast." Roz stood, dropping a kiss on Hope's head. "Because your daughter is going to need a mother who's present, not one who's too exhausted to enjoy her." The decision came from an unexpected source. Geneva was at the Family Resource Center for another supervised visitation when Damien asked if they could speak privately after the session. Dr. Rodriguez facilitated the conversation, maintaining professional boundaries while allowing them space to talk. "I've been offered a position." Damien's voice was careful, measured. "Advisory role at a startup in Seattle. It's a good opportunity, but it would mean relocating." Geneva's first reaction was relief. Distance would make co-parenting easier, would remove him from the daily landscape of her life. But then she thought of Hope, who was just beginning to recognize her father's face during visits. "What about Hope? I want to maintain visitation. We could establish a schedule where I fly back once a month, or you could bring her to Seattle occasionally. I know it's not ideal, but I think the position would be good for me. It's a chance to rebuild without being the villain in everyone's story here." Geneva considered this. The truth was, she did not want Damien in Chicago. Every time she saw him, she was reminded of everything she had survived. But she also recognized that he was trying, however imperfectly, to become someone better than he had been. "I'll agree to it on one condition. You commit to the visitation schedule in writing, and if you miss more than 2 visits in a year, you forfeit the right to regular contact." "That's fair." They worked out the details with Dr. Rodriguez's help, and Geneva left the meeting feeling a weight lift from her shoulders. Distance would not erase the past, but it would create space for both of them to build futures that did not constantly collide. That evening she made a decision. She called Maya and offered her a partnership in the gallery with full curatorial authority and equity stake. She called a woman named Diane Mercer, a former investment banker who had reached out months earlier expressing interest in joining the fund, and offered her the position of managing partner. Both women accepted immediately. Geneva spent the following week training them, sharing her vision, and gradually learning to trust that other people could carry the work forward without her constant oversight. It was terrifying and liberating in equal measure. July brought heat that shimmered off the pavement and turned the city into a furnace. Geneva took Hope to the park in early mornings before the temperature became unbearable, pushing the stroller along shaded paths while joggers and other parents moved through their routines. She was sitting on a bench watching Hope grab at leaves with uncoordinated hands when her phone rang. It was Harrison. "I need to tell you something before you hear it elsewhere. The board asked for my resignation." Geneva's stomach dropped. "Because of me. Because I chose principles over politics." Harrison's voice was calm, almost peaceful. "They gave me a generous severance package and a glowing recommendation, but the message was clear. They couldn't have a CEO who publicly supported someone they view as a threat." "Harrison, I'm so sorry. If I had known, don't. I made this choice with full awareness of the consequences. And I don't regret it." "What will you do?" Harrison laughed softly. "I've had offers. 3 different firms have approached me in the past month. Turns out there's value in being known as someone who won't compromise ethics for convenience." Geneva felt tears prick at her eyes. "Thank you. For everything. Thank you for showing my daughters what it looks like to fight for what matters." They talked for a few more minutes, and when Geneva ended the call, she sat in silence, processing the weight of what his support had cost him. She thought about power and privilege, about the ways that standing up for others could mean sacrificing your own position, about whether any of it was worth the price. Then she looked at Hope, who was gumming a leaf with intense concentration, and knew the answer. Everything worth having required sacrifice. The question was whether you chose what to sacrifice or let others choose for you. In late August, 9 months after the petition had been filed, Geneva received an envelope in the mail. The return address was a Seattle apartment complex. Inside was a handwritten letter on plain paper. "Geneva, I'm writing this from my new place. It's small, nothing like what I had, but it's mine in a way the penthouse never was. I've been thinking about what you said at the hospital, that I need to earn the privilege of being Hope's father. You were right. I'm not writing to ask for forgiveness or to explain myself. I'm writing because I want you to know that I see what you've built. The fund, the gallery, the way you've refused to let anyone else define your worth. It's extraordinary, and it's everything I failed to see when we were married. I spent our entire relationship trying to make you smaller so I could feel bigger. I told myself it was protection, that I was shielding you from the brutal realities of my world. The truth is, I was threatened by your intelligence, your vision, your capacity for things I couldn't control, so I tried to control you instead. I'm learning slowly that real power isn't about domination. It's about lifting up the people around you and trusting them to be magnificent. I'm learning this from my therapist, from watching what you've accomplished, and from the 2 hours every month when I get to hold our daughter and see the world through her eyes. I hope Hope grows up to be like you, fierce, principled, unwilling to settle for anything less than she deserves. I hope I get to watch her become that person even from a distance. And I hope that someday you can tell her that her father finally figured out how to be someone worth knowing. I don't expect a response. This isn't a request for absolution. It's just the truth written down so it exists outside my own head. Damien. Geneva read the letter 3 times, sitting at her kitchen table while Hope napped upstairs. She felt the complexity of her emotions, anger that still simmered beneath everything else, sadness for the marriage that had never been what she deserved, and a cautious hope that maybe someday co-parenting would become something less fraught. She did not write back. Instead, she folded the letter and placed it in a box in her closet where she kept documents that mattered: the settlement agreement, the first article about the fund, a photo of Hope at 1 week old. Evidence of transformation, of endings that became beginnings. Some things did not need a response. Sometimes the truth just needed to be witnessed. September arrived with the soft urgency of autumn, the light changing from summer's harsh brightness to something gentler. The gallery prepared for its fall exhibition. The fund celebrated its 6-month anniversary with returns that exceeded projections, and Geneva found herself settling into a rhythm that felt sustainable rather than exhausting. She had hired an assistant, a young woman named Jordan, who managed her calendar with ruthless efficiency. Diane was handling day-to-day operations of the fund, freeing Geneva to focus on strategic vision. Maya was curating the gallery's programming with bold choices that generated both controversy and acclaim. Geneva was learning to let go. On a Saturday morning in late September, she was working in her home office while Hope played on a blanket nearby when her phone rang. It was Margaret. "I have interesting news. The Smithsonian wants to partner with you on a traveling exhibition featuring women artists from your gallery. It's a major opportunity." Geneva felt a spike of excitement, followed immediately by suspicion. "What's the catch?" "No catch. They're impressed by what you've built, and they want to amplify it. This is legitimate. Margaret, people don't just offer opportunities like this without an agenda. Sometimes they do." Margaret's voice was warm. "Sometimes your work speaks for itself and people recognize the value. Not everything is a battle." General Geneva sat back in her chair, watching Hope stack wooden blocks with fierce concentration. "Maybe you're right." The partnership was formalized over the following weeks, and by October, Geneva was working with Smithsonian curators to develop an exhibition that would travel to 8 cities over 2 years. It was validation on a scale she had not imagined, proof that the gallery was more than a vanity project or a reaction to her divorce. It was real, and it was hers. Hope's first birthday arrived on a cold January morning, exactly 1 year after she had entered the world, screaming with righteous fury. Geneva threw a small party at the brownstone, inviting the circle of people who had supported her through the hardest year of her life: Roz, Margaret, Maya, Diane, Harrison, and his daughters, and a handful of artists from the gallery. She had not invited Damien, but he sent a gift, a children's book about a girl who builds a castle from stars. The inscription inside read, "For Hope. May you always reach for impossible things. Love, Dad." Geneva set the book on a shelf in the nursery and returned to the party, where Hope was demolishing a small cake with both hands, frosting smeared across her face. Everyone laughed and took photos, and Geneva felt a swell of gratitude for these people who had chosen to be her family. Later, after everyone had left and Hope was asleep, Geneva stood in the nursery and looked at the book Damien had sent. She opened it to the first page and read aloud to the empty room, testing the words. "Once there was a girl who wanted to touch the stars. Everyone told her it was impossible, that stars belonged in the sky and little girls belonged on the ground. But she didn't listen. Geneva closed the book and placed it back on the shelf. She thought about the woman she had been a year ago, pregnant and alone and preparing to fight for her future. She thought about the woman she was now, tired but triumphant, building something that mattered. She thought about Hope, who would grow up knowing that her mother had refused to accept someone else's definition of possible. The brownstone was quiet around her, but it was a different kind of quiet than she had known in the penthouse. It was the quiet of safety, of home, of a life built on bedrock rather than shifting sand. Geneva walked downstairs and poured herself a glass of wine, the first alcohol she had allowed herself since before the pregnancy. She carried it to the living room window and looked out at the street where snow was beginning to fall in fat, lazy flakes. Her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. She almost ignored it, but something made her look. "Congratulations on the Smithsonian partnership. You've built something extraordinary. D." Geneva stared at the message for a long moment, then deleted it without responding. She had learned that some chapters did not need epilogues, that some people belonged to the past, even when they tried to reach into the present. She took a sip of wine and felt the warmth spread through her chest. Tomorrow she would wake early and take Hope to the gallery. She would review proposals for the next exhibition. She would meet with Diane about expanding the fund's portfolio. She would continue building the life she had fought for, one decision at a time. But tonight, she allowed herself to simply be. To stand in her home, her daughter sleeping upstairs, her future stretching ahead with all its uncertainty and promise. She raised her glass to her reflection in the window, to knowing when to fight and when to let go, to building something that lasts, to proving that worth is not given, it's claimed. The woman looking back at her smiled, and Geneva recognized her completely. She was no longer the person who had signed away her power in a prenuptial agreement, believing that love required diminishment. She was no longer the person who had discovered betrayal and responded with quiet strategy. She was someone new, forged in the fire of the past year, but not defined by it. She was Geneva Merchant Ashford, founder and director of the Ashford Impact Fund, owner of the Ashford Gallery, mother of Hope, and architect of her own future. And she was only just beginning.